To help celebrate this moment, we've invited a guest speaker to give the commencement address. Dr. Allan Malmed completed his undergraduate degree at UIUC in 1982. He went on to complete his medical training at the University of Illinois at Chicago. This was followed by an internship at Louis A. Wise Memorial Hospital in Chicago. He then underwent training in diagnostic imaging at Loyola University, Chicago. Currently, Dr. Malmed is a radiologist in Arlington Heights and is affiliated with Northwest Community Hospital. He is also the director of the Breast Center at Northwest Community Hospital and chairs a not-for-profit charitable board of trustees called the ARC in Chicago. Dr. Malmed's wife, Missy, was a longtime high school teacher and is currently an adjunct instructor in English at the College of Lake County. The Malmeds have 3 sons. 2 have graduated college and are working, and the youngest is a senior in computer science engineering here at U of I. His father graduated from the U of I Medical School and is seated in the front row. Thank you, all of us. Thank you for joining us today. Please welcome Dr. Malmed.
Distinguished faculty, graduates, and guests. I would like to start out by thanking my dear friend Carol Augsburger for this invitation and for the honor. Carol and I met about 8 years ago in France, prepping for what would end up to be a glorious trip around the Mont Blanc Massif. It was crazy that in the middle of nowhere, we not only found a world-renowned botanist, but she was also a professor at my alma mater, the U of I. The trail was our classroom for over 100 miles, but we were surrounded by mountains, glaciers, and multiple ecosystems. Carol, of course, knew everything and was able to answer every question, but I think she's still a little irked at me because I can never remember the difference between a pine and a spruce. Now let me take you back a bit in time. I want you to try and picture me in 1977. I was a 16-year-old junior at Glenbrook North High School in Northbrook, Illinois. My hair was a huge afro, so large that on a passport photo from that time, it actually extended out the sides and the top of the photo. It was actually kind of ridiculous. My Levi's, for those of you who remember that era, after meticulous effort, had holes in the knees, were patched in the rear, and the bell bottoms were all shredded. That's how I wanted it. I was nearing the end of my junior year and in the waiting room for my obligatory meeting with my high school guidance counselor, and I was musing my future. I figured I would go to the University of Illinois. That's where my older sister went. I would take my pre-med curriculum as a biology major, and like my father, I would go on to medical school. This was all very clear to me. U of I, it was a no-brainer. World-class education, close to home, and if you can remember this far back, it was about $400 a semester. Also, I knew my GPA and ACT scores. And as part of the application materials for U of I, they had a little graphical tool that you could use. In one column was the ACT and the other column was your GPA. And if you connected your ACT and GPA, depending on where they were, if the line was above the mark, you were automatically going to be admitted. It was all very simple in those days. There was no essay, there was no interview. And my line was above the mark. Finally, I was called in and sat down across the desk from Mr. Smith, my guidance counselor, and I'm actually not using his real name for reasons that will become clear later. He was an imposing man with a thick head of silver hair, and he was a head varsity coach, so he was used to speaking with authority. Although I knew who he was, we had never met, and from the look on his face, I could tell that I was a stranger to him. He gave me a quick nod and looked at my folder, the folder that was sitting in front of him. After a few silent minutes, he began to speak. And the first thing he said was that he didn't think I was college material. Now, granted, my GPA was pretty low and was not nearly a match for my ACT, which was pretty decent. But still, I was dumbfounded. He went on telling me about alternatives such as trade school and the military. He could see the look on my face and try to console me with remarks like, "You don't need to be you don't need to go to college to have a happy life. But still, the expert on all things academic was telling me that what I thought was going to be my future was not possible. And I actually agreed with him. I didn't think you needed to go to college to be happy. But for me, who had always dreamed of being a doctor since I could remember, college was crucial. It was what I thought my life was going to be. He offered to give me materials for application to trade school, etc., which I declined. I went home and thought about the meeting and its possible repercussions. Should I follow the expert's advice? This guy must know what he's talking about. He is, after all, the person who the high school chose to advise its students on all things about college. Or should I ignore him? A couple of months went by. I eventually filled out my U of I application and was admitted before Thanksgiving. Now, let's flash forward another 4 years, and now I'm at the end of my junior year here at the University of Illinois in the School of Biology. That's what they used to call it. My hair was now a pretty manageable mop. I was sporting a comfortably faded pair of blue jeans, and I had met my later wife-to-be and was doing my dim best to maintain a decent appearance. I was meeting for the first and only time with my academic advisor. She was looking at my academic record and MCAT scores, and after a few moments of contemplation, told me that she didn't think I should apply to medical school because my grades and scores were not up to standard and that I would not be admitted. She started to give me ideas for alternative careers. I listened patiently, thanked her for her time, and having been down this road before, I applied to medical school and was admitted to all but one of the schools that I applied to. Once again, I'm going to ask you to flash forward into the future, now 9 years. And I've just finished my 4 years at the U of I and the 5 years of my radiology residency training, and I was hired on as a radiologist. I was looking forward to a career of interventional procedures, ultrasounds, MRIs, CAT scans. My hair was now a reasonable approximation of my current style, but was a much different color, and obviously my forehead was much smaller. Actually, I call this my 5-head now. Anticipating my first real paycheck, I'd splurged on a new shirt and an actual pair of slacks. On my very first day, I was called by the technologist into a room. A patient was waiting for an exam. And there, sitting there, with the same thick head of gray hair, was Mr. Smith, with the exact same look of unrecognition on his face. Yes, the same Mr. Smith who had tried to dash my career dreams. Now, as you might imagine, several competing thoughts and urges were floating in my head. Should I remind him of our meeting of 13 years ago? I mean, who actually ever gets the opportunity to confront someone like this? Or should I quietly carry this back with me to my office? I had to remind myself he was simply a patient who was worried about the outcome of the exam that I was about to perform. I, of course, chose the latter. I stuffed these thoughts back into my head and quietly went back to my office after finishing the exam. So why am I telling you this ridiculous story? It contains a lesson that I unfortunately learned at the age of 16, and that is that nobody knows what you are capable of better than you. It will happen to you over and over and over again in your life, where someone tells you what you cannot do, or that an idea you have is impractical, or that you're not the person for the job. And I guess sometimes they're right, but always remember that you are the best judge of what you're capable of, and nobody else. Now I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking about happiness. When perusing the list of alumni that have stood at this podium in past years, it is clear that my career is very different from those that have preceded me on this lectern. There are no international science awards or Fortune 500 companies, and I'm definitely not an astronaut. It was my outside activities of work that caused Carol to seek me out. Soon after starting work as a radiologist, it became very clear to me that my strong desire to share my knowledge and experience as a doctor in a charitable way was not going to be practical. Radiology is a field that is highly dependent on technology that also tends to be extraordinarily expensive. For example, Doctors Without Borders would have no need for someone who needs a CT scanner or an MRI. These machines cost millions, they're not mobile, and they require a facility. Most of their clinics are in the field with rudimentary equipment. So I sublimated my desires and volunteered on the board of directors of a not-for-profit social service agency in Chicago called the ARC. Included in their spectrum of services is a free medical clinic and pharmacy. I was able to advise them on strategic planning and help recruit doctors and pharmacists to serve. But I was unable, because of my specialty, to roll up my sleeves. My relationship with the ARC has been long and fruitful, and to this day I still serve as chairman of the Board of Trustees. Every time I walk into that building on California and Devon in northern Chicago, I get a feeling that is very difficult to describe, but know that nothing else that I do in my life gives me a similar sense of well-being and fulfillment. At the hospital, I devoted my energies to the emerging field of breast cancer screening. Right now, it seems very well established and normal, but in 1991, we had to figure the whole thing out ourselves. After a lot of work and experimenting, trial and error, we managed to establish a breast center with a very unique culture. Our two prime directives were to have the best technology available and to deliver care in the most compassionate way possible. We discovered that for most of our patients, the most difficult part of their annual screening was the interminable wait for the results, and I think most of the women who have been through this will concur. So we concentrated on creating a system whereby the patients got the results at the time of their mammogram, and if their mammogram was abnormal, we did their full workup right then and there. We're now the second or third largest screening program in all of Illinois. I've also contributed at the hospital by serving as president of the medical staff and on the hospital board of directors. As the years passed and technology progressed, one of my partners noticed a posting on the American College of Radiology website from Phnom Penh, Cambodia. Turns out USAID, which is a branch of the State Department that gives aid, had purchased a CT scanner and a mammography unit for a small charity hospital in the capital. And though they spent millions of dollars on the equipment, had failed to provide a single cent for training. The radiologists there were desperate, and we immediately contacted them and began preparing for a journey to Southeast Asia. After a long day of travel, we made our way to Sihanouk Hope Hospital in Phnom Penh. We entered the hospital through the front door. The patient waiting area surrounded the entrance and consisted of 10 rows of plastic chairs, each filled with a patient that was sicker than anyone that I had ever seen as a physician. These patients came from all over the country and waited, sometimes for days to be seen, and often having spent their last dime to get to this hospital. A quick reminder on Cambodian history. In the 1970s, some of you may remember, the communist regime of Pol Pot, in an effort to suppress intellectuals, attempted and largely succeeded in murdering all their professionals, including their doctors and nurses. The country was left not only without healthcare workers, but it had nobody to train the next generation of healthcare workers, and thus that explains the difficult situation they were in. So we got to work with lectures and case reviews. It was very clear that the radiologists needed much training with CT, but the mammography was a whole different story. They did not know the first thing. As a result, we arranged to sponsor one of the radiologists to come to our hospital for 6 weeks to learn mammography. She came to our breast center. She stayed with a local Cambodian family, and after much hard work, she became proficient and returned to Phnom Penh and is now actually the only trained mammographer in all of Cambodia. So a few years passed, and later we saw another posting, this time from a small hospital in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, once again asking for help with a CT scanner. As you may remember, Haiti suffered a devastating earthquake in 2010 in its capital, which virtually destroyed their entire infrastructure. A poor country to begin with, the conditions there are now absolutely indescribable. I was just there this past winter, and despite having influenza, I will never forget the things that I saw and the things that we did. We now have an ongoing arrangement with this hospital to provide daily pro bono CT interpretation, and we're training their residents. We have trained physicians there to do ultrasound and CT-guided procedures and are now in the process of forming a new not-for-profit that will exist to provide curriculum and training for radiology residents throughout the developing world. I'm telling you these stories because they lead me to my second point, which is about happiness. I happen to have been born at the very tail end of the baby boom generation, and of the many features that have been documented about our group, the one that unfortunately stands out to me is this constant search for happiness. You always hear people say, "I just want to be happy." Or people go on retreats to remote and usually exotic resorts with the idea that they're going to find happiness. Yet I think these thoughts and pursuits are ultimately empty. I'm not the first to ruminate on this subject. Margaret Lee Runbeck, an author from the earlier parts of the 20th century, she said, "Happiness is not a station to arrive at, but a manner of living." And Eleanor Roosevelt, in a similar vein, "Happiness is not a goal, but the product of a life well lived." And if you're looking for wisdom, the Dalai Lama is always a wonderful source. And he said, "If you want others to be happy, practice compassion. If you want to be happy, practice compassion." So now to the grads of 2014. You may not have absorbed this yet, but you have now entered the elite of society. You have been presented with all the rigors of a science curriculum and overcome all the challenges the faculty has put before you. Your community has invested in you, and now will put their faith in you to lead, to create, and to protect. It is now up to you to answer this faith with action and responsibility. Do not frivolously seek happiness. Rather, lead a decent and fruitful life. Take care of the less fortunate and create wealth. These activities of my own that I talked about have led me to what some may describe as happiness. I don't know what it is. But each and every one of you has to find your own way. But I implore you to do so with urgency. Do these things, and happiness will sneak through the window and tap you on the shoulder. Thank you, and congratulations, class of 14.
Thank you so very much for that wonderful address. Today we recognize SIB graduates who have earned special honors, and we will award School of Integrative Biology degrees, including degrees in the Department of Animal Biology, Entomology, Plant Biology, and the program in Ecology, Evolution, and Conservation Biology. The degrees will be awarded in the order bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctoral degrees. Dr. Martinez will begin by recognizing the Bachelor of Science candidates graduating with honors.